Good evening, everybody. I'm going to present two things that are an overview of some of the technological aspects that involve blockchain-based systems and how some of the things that, some of the elements that allow transactions to occur inside of a blockchain, and in cryptocurrencies, for example, is taking place. I'm not going to go too much into technical details, but I would like to focus more on the implications of some of the design principles that exist around cryptocurrencies and blockchains in general, as we are going to see during today's session. As a little bit of background, I am professor at the University of Zurich, and I am one of the founding members of the Blockchain Center of our university, which is a competence center inside of the structural organization of it. My main research interests are the economic aspects of blockchain implementations, ranging from the incentive schemes that are placed during the design of cryptocurrencies and blockchains in general, to, because I am interested in the link between the microscopic behavior of agents that connect to these kind of systems with the emergent properties that you end up observing. And you will see that even though I'm going to cover the topics that are present in your program, some of the things I'm going to try to reinterpret from this viewpoint. I will be happy to discuss more technical elements of the system. I will have an intrinsic bias in the way in which I present them. The most widespread application of blockchain technologies, as you obviously know, are cryptocurrencies. And this is exactly the topic of my first part of the presentation tonight. Then I'm going to deal more with blockchains, as you are going to see, have some scalability issues. There have been different ways in which people have tried to address these issues that the system has. And one of the paradigmatic examples of this are payment channels that occur not necessarily at the level of the blockchain. And then we're going to look at how these solutions work and whether they satisfy the design principles of blockchain-based systems. One thing that happened through history in general, not only, I mean, one thing that happened through history is the fact that society is arranged in some way around governments, and eventually governments took over the right to create mediums of exchange because of multiple things. On the one hand, because it gives them the right of seigniorage. In this way, you can control the economic policy in some way or another. This thing has been sophisticated, getting more and more sophisticated over the centuries. Because controlling the monetary supply is something that allows different ways of economic policy. One thing that we have to see is that why do we trust this banknote issued by the Swiss National Bank? Simply because there is a single issuer of this kind of banknotes, and we assign values. Through history, the reasons why I assign value to this changed, but we assigned value to it regardless of the actual cost that it has its production, because we can identify it, and because the institution that is behind is able to is trustworthy. What is very interesting is that even if the issuance of currencies has been centralized, there is a single agent that is able to do it in a nation or in a country, we have to recognize something, which is the fact that the way in which we have been using these banknotes, this medium of exchange, always was done in a completely decentralized fashion from a societal point of view. Every time that I go to a coffee shop and I spend 5 Swiss francs to pay for a coffee, the transaction is only bilateral between the recipient of the transaction and myself, and I get some change and I get the product in return for the monetary exchange. If you see this, there is no control whatsoever except for the fact that all of us trust the medium of exchange, and this is what allows the transaction to take place. So from that point of view, if you look at this from the systemic perspective, it is a fully decentralized system because the economy works because we, in a decentralized fashion, exchange value through this widespread accepted medium of exchange.
Can I ask?
Yes.
But we are not really trusting the instrument. We are trusting that this is a promissory note, right? So we are trusting the central bank.
Absolutely.
Eventually, at the presence of that, is going to pay us something.
Not with
cover some kind of value, right?
Not with the fiat currencies. With the fiat currencies, we don't have any promissory value from any third party.
But this is a promissory note, right? It says the central bank is promising that it's going to give you that value, right? That this.
No, the central bank prints this banknote, prints newer ones, but prints this banknote, and then the value is simply assigned because they have the right of seigniorage, but there is no promissory value of anything else. It only, I seem to understand what you are meaning is that every time that they print such banknote, it has a value already assigned on the face, and we trust this value. True. But still, what I am saying is that if the transaction takes place, there is no central control whatsoever. When we exchange it, it's something that happens just naturally, organically inside of society. This is not what happened in the late 20th century. The late 20th century, and here it is perhaps interesting to see what happened with the computer infrastructure. Do you remember that in the 50s, you may well know that in the 50s, all the computer infrastructure was client-server architecture simply because computers were really expensive, and then a lot of dumb terminals were connected to a central node. In the 70s, internet is developed, and it's a fully decentralized network of interconnected computers that allows routing of information to go through different paths in such a way that can always reach destination. So the way in which data has been managed and has been traveling through the computer networks changed dramatically in 50 years. And this is what created a system that is very resilient. Internet is something that is very resilient, and we can transmit a lot of information from multiple parties that exist in it without any kind of central coordination. Going back to the economics of this thing, of the economic transactions, what happened in the 90s when everything became digital, also the payments, is that whenever economic actors inside of society wanted to exchange value through a payment network, through the network, so in this layer you have economic actors, and for example, this user wants to pay to this shop a particular amount of money. The way in which this transaction occurs at the technical level is the fact that this user, for example, wants to issue a transaction through internet or showing the credit card inside of the shop. The shop or the communication channel between the two of them is verified through a central authority, that is the card issuer, for example. And only after this central verification point acknowledges that this is a legitimate business and that the credit card that is shown has the or the debit card has enough funds to satisfy the requirement, the payment is accepted, and then the economic transaction occurs between this agent and this shop. And you see that from the point of view of this metaphor of what happened in internet, what happened with the economic transactions once we ended in a digital world is that all the process became centralized. And this happens everywhere. You have very few points of failure, actually. And this is why, in principle, even if the systems are redundant and whatnot, this kind of architecture is quite weak, because you resort on very few points in which trust is generated. There is a way of looking at what happens in these transactions. And it is worded in a very strange way, simply to explain why the development of payment systems through blockchains is particularly novel and seen before. What happens here in decentralized payment systems is that they are able to propagate trustworthy information through trusted communication channels. If this channel is in some way corrupted, or this channel is in some way corrupted, or any actor in between, or this actor is also tamed in some way, the transaction is not safe anymore. It is only safe when all the ingredients inside of the transaction are trustworthy. And this is why this kind of system is quite, the logic of functioning of these systems is quite obvious. And this is basically what gives to this is what leads to the creation of cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are systems, let's say payment systems through blockchains, are systems that allow to propagate trustworthy information, but more importantly, they also allow the creation of trust between parties that do not trust each other originally in a completely decentralized fashion, with these ingredients that I more or less mentioned already. One is the fact that the peers do not necessitate trust with each other up front, and that the propagation of information among these actors even persists in presence of non-trusted communication channels. Here we have a different representation. More or less, these two layers that we see here are related to what I've shown you before. Now, the verification layer of the network of transactions, these are economic agents. They are making transactions with each other, and this is what these links represent. In this second layer, there is a peer-to-peer network of computers that perform the verification process in a decentralized fashion. There is an important element here as well. You see that the different economic actors, in some way or another, they are connected to the peer-to-peer network. Cryptocurrencies in particular are a decentralized payment system that follows this architecture, that has a kind of native token that can be exchanged by the individuals that are connected to the network. These cryptocurrencies as well lack a well-defined identity in general of the system participants. Therefore, the trust is not enabled by the identification of the individuals, simply by the fact that they are connected to the network. And in this way, these individuals, because this native token exists in the system, are able to exchange value with each other. There are two layers at which we can look at the remember, this is the network, this is a peer-to-peer network that performs the verification task. One important aspect of this system is that the different users that are connected to the network have what usually is called wallets. These wallets encapsulate a set of pseudonyms that are used by the users, that are used by the system participants to identify themselves. Therefore, these wallets are populated in general with something that is called an address, which is a cryptographic pair of public and private keys. The users exchange these public keys in such a way that they receive transactions in a way we are going to see in a second. Another thing that is particularly important in this kind of topology is the fact that this peer-to-peer network, the network of verification, is not a one-to-one mapping to the network of users, because in general, multiple users connect to the verification network through a single point. Like in this example in which you have 3 different users that connect to the verification network through the same node. This example can be whatever, a web service that provides online storage of cryptographic keys, and then multiple users connect through the same node. Some others may be just users that connect their own network to the peer-to-peer network, and this is the way in which they share information. And here it is also displayed the fact that a single user may have multiple addresses with different holdings. Pseudonymity refers exactly to these kind of things. It is not that there is a clear identification of which is the user, in the sense that there is no what in a financial system would be a know your client kind of setup. A single user is able to create many of these identities, and a priori it is not known which addresses belong to the same user. On the one hand, you have, we already described, which is this network of transactions. These were users then connected to the verification network. So how do the transactions take place? Imagine that this user wants to send perhaps 8 bitcoins to this other user in the system. What this user has, this user is, like everybody else, is connected to the verification network. What he does is, he grabs his private key, he signs the transaction, he says, I want to send part of my holdings to this identification. He creates a transaction, he crafts a transaction, cryptographically signing it, by which he specifies this wish, and then communicates this transaction that he has just created to one of the nodes, to the node that he's connected to inside of the verification layer. You see that in the verification layer, there are some circles that represent the computing nodes that are connected to the verification network, and you have some edges, some links connecting different nodes. These links represent the possible pathways of information inside of the verification network. In this specific case, given the fact that this user is connected only to this node, what is going to happen is that when this node receives the information about this new transaction, this transaction is broadcasted by this node to all the nodes it knows its existence inside of the verification network. In particular, this node only knows the existence of this other node inside of the verification layer. In parentheses, these possible pathways of information flow inside of this layer also represent two other very important aspects of this network. On the one hand, that nodes only have local information about the existence of other nodes. This node has a list of peers, that's why it is called a peer-to-peer network. This red node has a list of peers that only contains this node in the network. Therefore, whatever information he receives, he's going to broadcast it further to the nodes that he knows in his list, which in this case is only this one. Given the fact that this node came to know this transaction, what he does is broadcasting it to its neighbor, and when the neighbor gets to know this transaction, repeats the process of gossiping the new transaction that has been received, which means that sends it further to this network, to this node in the network, and this process is repeated until everybody inside of this layer, not necessarily it's not repeated until everybody. Everybody locally broadcasts this information to its neighbors, and given the fact that everybody is doing this thing, eventually this transaction is going to reach everybody in this network.
What does constitute neighboring? Is it locality, physical locality?
No, it's a good question. What happens is whenever you launch a client that connects to one of these peer-to-peer networks, you launch the Bitcoin client, Ethereum, or whatever, the first thing that this node does is connecting to what is called a supernode, and the supernode replies back a list of other computers it knows they are connected currently to the network. It only broadcasts to you a subset of these computers. Okay? This is what creates your list. Some nodes are going to drop off from the network, and those, when you try to connect to a node which is not replying anymore, you remove it from your list. From time to time, you also receive information about new nodes from your neighbors as well. So this network is quite dynamic, and this is how the network is constructed. And this is why all the information for the nodes, except for the initial point in which they get the list of neighbors, everything else becomes local. But there is no geographical locality, at least in the implementations of most cryptocurrencies. So in the pathway of the verification of the dynamics of this transaction, we ended up in the situation where all these nodes that are connected to the verification network get to know the transaction. So they have a local copy of the transaction in their memory. Actually, this is usually called, technically there is something called the mempool. The mempool is a space of memory, a chunk of memory that each node is able to fill with the transactions that get to be known by them. So far nothing happened. The only thing that we know is that this guy created the transaction, signed it, and now everybody got to know it. What all these nodes, or many of these nodes, are doing inside of this peer-to-peer network is a process called mining that we're going to see in a few minutes what it means. For the moment, the only thing that is important to us is the fact that there is a point in time in which one of these nodes verifies the correctness of the transactions, and by different rules, one of them that we're going to see tonight is proof of work, but one of them is allowed to encapsulate multiple transactions into a single chunk that is called a block, and this block eventually, so all the transactions that are verified by this node are put inside of a block, perhaps this transaction then gets into the block that was created by this node. And when this block has been created, we are going to talk about the process of block creation later. Once again, this is information that only this node has in the network, this new block. The process repeats again. This block that is created, crafted by this node is broadcasted to its neighbors, that also, given the fact that it is new, is broadcasted to all the other neighbors of their successive neighbors until this block gets to be known by all the computing nodes that are connected to the peer-to-peer network. At this stage, now you have that this transaction has been verified by the node, by the network, and its verification has become known to everybody inside of the system, and only then, in principle, you can say that the transaction between this user and this one has taken place. Okay? Remember, there are two things then. Transactions are created by single nodes in the network. Transactions are verified by nodes in the peer-to-peer network, and once they are verified by a single node that distributes this information to everybody else, once this verification has become known to everybody inside of the verification layer, only then we can say roughly that the verification took place between the two nodes. As we are going to see later, this is not necessarily enough to guarantee that the transaction takes place. But a priori, this is the design principle of the system. You see that here there is I was talking about incentives at the beginning of this presentation. Here you see that there is a cost for all the nodes that are running the network. There is a cost that is they are doing things that are costly. They are transmitting information, but they are also processing the verification of the transactions that take place in the system. So why should nodes bear the burden of doing the verification process? As you may know, cryptocurrencies, many cryptocurrencies have this process that is called mining, and mining exactly is the reward that is conceived inside of the logic of the cryptocurrencies to attribute some economic gain to the nodes that participate of the verification process, that help the system to be consistent, as it is written here. And there is, as we are going to see later, is the fact that all the nodes, anybody in cryptocurrencies can participate of this process of verification, and given the fact that you have an economic reward, the whole idea of this kind of systems is to have a decentralized monetary supply system, as we are going to see later. Let us go back to this layer of the transaction. As we said before, from an economic point of view, if we want to understand the way in which people make transactions in the system, the actual structure of the verification network is unimportant, as it is unimportant as well to know which kind of infrastructure Visa is running in their server farms. There is something, however, that allows to construct this kind of networks, which is a particularly active research area inside of the community. Let us look a little bit how we can construct, let us focus for a few minutes on how is it possible to create this network of transactions between users. And then let me explain to you how the Bitcoin transactions look like with a very simple example. Okay? Bitcoin transactions have something that is called UTXO, unexpended transaction outputs. As I already said, inside of the blockchain, a blockchain is a chain of blocks. Each block is a set of verified transactions, and each transaction has basically two fields. If you want to transact some value in a ledger, what you have is a part of the transaction that is called an input, because this is which is the money that is going to be spent inside of the transaction, and you have an output, that is who are going to be the recipients of the transaction. In particular, in Bitcoin, the most relevant fields, there are others, but the most relevant fields for the basic transactions that can be executed inside of the Bitcoin network, or all the UTXO-based transaction ledgers, the most important thing to look at actually is the output of the transaction. The output of the transaction says, in a basic transaction, which is the address that can spend which amount of Bitcoins. So you have a list of addresses, and to each address that is listed inside of the output can spend this amount of Bitcoins that are there. Now let us try to understand what is in the input of the transaction. The input in the transaction is actually the process, depicts the process of spending a given amount of Bitcoins that were received in a previous transaction. So they are a link. There is this part of the input transaction is simply a link to the previous transaction where this address received the assets. That's why in this second transaction, in the input, there are two fields. One points to this part of this transaction, points to this part. Therefore, by looking at the previous information in this transaction, we know that this address can actually spend these 12 Bitcoins, and the second field of the input address is, of the input field of this transaction is a pointer to this other transaction in which this other address received the right to spend 24 Bitcoins. Once again, the output address is constituted by a set of other addresses that are going to link back to this transaction when they want to spend it. But we were talking about user identification, pseudonymity, and so on and so forth. Until 2017, every time that you saw a transaction like this one, it meant only one thing. It meant that these two addresses belong to the same user. And why? Remember that the addresses are cryptographic pairs of public and private keys. In order to create this transaction, in order to create this transaction, a user must sign with the private key in order to have the right to spend the private key of this address, in order to have the right to spend these 12 Bitcoins, and at the same time it must sign with the private key of this address to show that he has the right to spend the 24 Bitcoins. Therefore, there is a user that is able to sign at the same time for these two addresses, and the only way that existed technically to do so is if you had the private keys of the two addresses at the same time, which means that you are the same user. Every time, therefore, that you look at the Bitcoin blockchain until 2017, and most of the transactions afterwards, actually, every time that you identify multiple addresses in a Bitcoin transaction, all the input addresses in a single transaction, in general, belong to the same user. I say in general because in 2017 it became possible to sign the same transaction with at different points in time. So you can partially sign a transaction, send it to the network, and someone else is able to sign the second part of the transaction. But given the fact that it has to happen on purpose, these transactions are also particularly rare. There is another aspect that involves the kind of transactions that you have inside of the Bitcoin blockchain, which is the following thing. Inside of this transaction, you can only spend the amount of Bitcoins that you received in the previous in a previous one. So you are only entitled to spend the 12 Bitcoins that you received in this transaction, but you cannot spend less. This also applies to the output of this transaction in which he received 24 Bitcoins. He cannot spend less than the 24. These two input fields together sum up 36 Bitcoins. And this is where the things become complicated, because it is very unlikely that in your past history you received exactly the amount of Bitcoins that you want to spend in a transaction. So it is very unlikely that you exactly want to spend 36 Bitcoins, 36 Bitcoins in these transactions. Actually, the most likely thing is that you want to send a few Bitcoins to different addresses. Imagine that you want to send to address X 10 Bitcoins and to address Y 25 Bitcoins. The transaction, as crafted by the system, is going to look pretty much like this one, in which everything that is the rest of the transaction, the change of the transaction, is going to go to a third address. In this case, these 0.5 Bitcoins are going to be a change address, and this address also belongs to the same user that is creating the transaction. So inside of the set of transactions that you observe in a blockchain like the one in Bitcoin, inside of a transaction there are multiple addresses in the input and some in the output that belong to the same user. That is the one that created the transaction. Which means that when you start to analyze the transactions inside of the Bitcoin blockchain, you get to know a lot of information about, remember, this is created because of anonymity. You want to create multiple addresses. You want to create multiple addresses in such a way that you cannot be identified. However, as soon as you have crafted this transaction, you are already disclosing the fact that these two addresses belong to you and not to anybody else. The more you make transactions, the more you are disclosing information about yourself. And this is what enables a lot of processes of user identification to run in blockchains like the one in Bitcoin. I already talked about this way of storing the transaction. This is the unexpected transactions output, like in Bitcoin and in many others, Litecoin, Dogecoin, all these families. There are other blockchain-based systems like Ethereum, in which this is not the way in which the transactions occur, but the transactions only occur between single addresses to single output addresses. And the system stores, as we are going to see later, a full vector of wealth of each address inside of the network. Okay? And then this is a way in which the transactions can be created inside of Ethereum. We create also a lot of overhead in the way in which you are able to, in the information that you must keep, because you must do bookkeeping of all the incoming transactions and outgoing transactions for each single individual inside of the system, for each single address inside of the system.
So essentially, what you just described is it uses an equivalent to the traditional T-entry system. Right?
I'm going to go to this in a second. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, it is just a representation of.
And the fee is just taking at source.
Exactly.
Okay.
Actually, you pay the fee, in particular in Bitcoin, you pay the fee for whatever is not allocated to the output addresses. And in general, you only create this fee to make the processing of your transaction faster. Mm-hmm. Here. So, let me divert a little bit on one thing that let us sum up the two ways of thinking what happens in general in all the cryptocurrencies with respect to the transactions. This node, this network are the transactions between different addresses. These are two addresses, this is a transaction between them. But this is not the real representation of the economic transactions between the different users. What happens actually is that multiple of these addresses belong to the same users. Therefore, you can cluster them and replace all these fake transactions, or let's say spurious transactions between addresses to actual transactions between the users. There are multiple ways in which you can do this. There are techniques that allow to do incredible amounts of things, but doing this kind of process does not mean de-anonymizing the network. It only means understanding which is the set of economic entities that are active inside of the system, but there is no way to link this bunch of addresses to a wallet inside of a specific computer inside of the system, because here we only know information about the public keys that are inside of the system, but nothing else. One thing that is particularly important is when you analyze the data, and this is also something that talks a lot about the unequal distribution of wealth inside of cryptocurrencies. What you'll see is that the number of addresses that belong to the same user is a very skewed and very broad degree distribution. Actually, if you see here, there are multiple users that have tens of thousands of addresses, like for example exchanges, or hundreds of thousands, but there are users that have anything between hundreds and thousands of users, of addresses belonging to them, as you identify by these methods that I was explaining before. Let me start, because if I start talking about payment channels now, it will not make any sense for you. I acknowledge this. Let me start with the second presentation and go back to this final part of this one later. Is it fine? We have been talking a lot about the internal elements that describe the transactions between the. We were only talking about transactions, but we don't know anything about how this relates to the actual working of a cryptocurrency. So let us go to it. And then we are going to talk about token creation, how these tokens are created, because what we have seen so far is that tokens are transacted. By where do they come from? And what is the reasoning of creating these tokens? So remember, what we want to, the achievement that we want to, let's say the system that we want to create is one that allows us to create a decentralized payment system. And the main challenge of such a system is how to ensure that that we know the balance of the users inside of the system, because otherwise people would like to claim that they have assets that they do not. And the blockchain is a very simple solution for this, because the only thing, as it was pointed out before, is just a ledger of the transactions that take place inside of the system. What I have been talking about, the description of how the transactions look like, at the global level, it is simply a balance sheet, sorry, a database in which each entry is a transaction that is taking place between two users. And I want to more or less repeat what I have been already saying about the way in which transactions take place. Inside of this table, there are 4 columns in principle. One of them is an identifier for a transaction. The second column is who is the sender of the transaction. The third column is who is the recipient of the transaction. And the fourth column is the amount of assets that are exchanged between these two users. We have the public ledger, but as I said, the most typical attack that would be is someone claiming that wants to send some assets to another system user, but he wants to send assets that actually this person does not have. To avoid, if we had only this information, it would be particularly cumbersome to do this thing. Actually, this is the way in which Ethereum works, and this requires having the state, the balance of each user inside of a state system at some point. In order to avoid this, what Bitcoin blockchains do, Bitcoin-like blockchains do with this UTXO, is what I said before, is pointing to the transaction where these funds have been received. In this case, Bob wants to send to Sam 5 Bitcoins, and Bob specifies, I want to send to Sam 5 Bitcoins that I received in this transaction. Given the fact that this is a ledger, and if we assume that this ledger contains the bookkeeping of all the possible transactions that took place between the system participants since the beginning of the system was created, everybody, if this is a public ledger, everybody can go to the ledger and see that actually Bob received these 5 Bitcoins by someone else in this transaction. By checking that this thing is correct, we know that this transaction, we have verified that this transaction is legitimate, and then we can also add it to the ledger. There is something else that can happen, which is that Bob wants to double spend the transaction that he received from Alice. If in a future transaction Bob wants to send the same 5 Bitcoins to another system participant, given the fact that this is a complete ledger of the transaction, of all the transactions, we can see that this transaction was already spent here. So no one is going to validate this transaction because these assets were already spent previously. And this is exactly why you need 2 things that are fundamentally important inside of a blockchain. On the one hand, the fact that the blockchain is the complete storage of all the transactions that took place inside of the system. And second, that these transactions have a kind of temporal order. It is fundamental to know that this transaction took place in some way before this one, and this is why we assume that this is legitimate and this is not. This is why a blockchain is the way in which this thing is solved. Here we have two problems, actually, that we didn't disclose how they are solved. On the one hand is, we more or less explained that we can verify the nature of a transaction, if it is legitimate or not. But it looks like it is a costly process. Every time that the new transaction comes, we have to bear the burden of checking whether the transaction was spent or not, whether actually this transaction exists and is whatever Sam is claiming and so on, Bob is claiming and so on and so forth. So there are multiple things that have to be done. It looks like the verification process is costly. Everybody has to have a copy, must have a copy. So this seems to be a reasonable solution, but we don't know why people should verify. But there is another problem that we still did not address. The transactions that I see here are only liabilities on the side of the senders. So if Bob received these 5 bitcoins in a previous transaction from Alice, and this is the full history, upwards we see. Do you have a pointer, Nigel? As I said, if Bob received this transaction from Alice previously, Alice at some point should have received also these 5 bitcoins from someone else back in history. But given the fact that this ledger is finite, we have a problem, which is there has to be a point in which these assets were created. Because so far we only have exchanges, but we do not have creation. And the best thing that occurs inside of blockchain-based systems in cryptocurrencies is the fact that the two, thank you very much, is the fact that the two questions, why to verify and how to create assets, are answered, thank you very much, are answered exactly with the same mechanism. And this is why cryptocurrencies are a brilliant construct. So what the system participants do is let us remember what I said when I was explaining what happens with the transactions. Transactions take place, all the system participants are verifying them, and when they verify them, they bundle them. They bundle them into a block of verified transactions, actually. And by the process of bundling of all the verified transactions inside of a block, the block creator is also allowed to something else. That is, he's allowed to create a transaction inside of the block that he has just created, in which he receives a nominal amount of cryptocurrencies, and this transaction has no sender. It only has a recipient, that is himself. Therefore, the system is constructed in such a way that verifiers want to verify because they want to be allowed to create this additional transaction for themselves, in which they get rewarded for the process of transaction verification. So you have a system that is consistent, and the system is consistent because it is in the best interest of the verifiers to keep the system consistent. And so the incentive of the verifier and the incentive of the system as a whole, from that point of view, are aligned. And this process of asset creation is the only way in which cryptocurrencies enter into circulation inside of the system.
So if Bob receives from Alice 5 Bitcoin, and the identifier of the transaction was A23 at the end, there, at the beginning, and then further down Bob gives this 5 to Sam, and the received verify is A23, which corresponds to Alice and Bob's transaction.
Yeah.
What if Bob receives 10, 5 from Alice and 5 from Claudia, and then Bob gives 5, which is not necessarily the Alice's 5, but is half of Alice's and half of Claudia's to Sam? How would that be represented? And how do we know that? And does it matter? And where is that going to be in the transaction?
The point is that Bob does not know which are the 5 Bitcoins that he's spending. Because Bitcoins, at least in this conception, they are fungible. So the user has not the right to decide which are the Bitcoins that he's, well, in principle, this is not true, but at least how the client is configured, it doesn't matter from whom he received these 5 Bitcoins. This was true by the time in which the system was created. Now, what I say so happily is not anymore true because of a very interesting economic process that's taking place inside of Bitcoin, which is that the Bitcoin is becoming non-fungible as an asset. And then it is very important from whom you received it. It's going to become more of a problem in the future years. So, answering your question, if Bob wanted to spend 10 Bitcoins that he received from 2 different transactions, in this kind of representations, it would be seen in 2 different rows inside of this ledger. Because one would be in which he spends these 5 Bitcoins and the other 5 Bitcoins. But he would only be able, at least how Bitcoin is constructed, this is not what happens in Ethereum, but in the way in which Bitcoin is constructed, Bob is only allowed to spend exactly the funds that he received in a previous transaction, nothing else, which simplifies a lot the technical design of Bitcoin as a ledger. Yeah, it simplifies a lot, but then it creates asymmetries in the flow of currencies. So, and then we go to the next step, which is what is mining in these kind of systems. Because however computationally expensive may be the process of creating, of verifying the transactions, computers get faster, and whatever was something computationally costly in 2010 is not going to be any more costly now, nor is going to continue to be costly in the future. So mining is a process that is completely arbitrary, by which the amount of blocks that are created inside of the system is limited, is capped artificially. The only purpose that mining has is to limit the amount of blocks that get appended to the system at each point in time. Why? There is in the computer science literature, there is this well-known fact that for the system to be consistent, these kind of systems, distributed systems, to be consistent, it has to be computationally costly to add new information, but in some way it has to be very cheap from a computational point of view to verify the information that is contained inside of the to the information that you are appending. So mining is a process as we are going to see, actually in proof of work, mining refers to the following thing. Mining refers to the fact that the verifiers, in order, remember what I said when I was describing the flow of the transactions and how the transactions enter into a block. Eventually, a miner is allowed to create a block. This is what I said. What I meant by this is the fact that miners that have already verified the transactions must solve a problem a cryptographic problem whose solution can only be found by brute force. Brute force means that they have to try as many solutions as possible until one of these, must try possible solutions until one of them actually satisfies the condition that has to be done. In the specific case of Bitcoin, this means applying a highly nonlinear function which has basically a few parameters. The three most important are the ones that I am explaining in this equation that I'm going to describe in a second. And the result of applying this function with these three parameters has to be smaller than a particular threshold. This threshold is just a number, and what this means is that I must obtain a result that is sufficiently small. It becomes apparent then that if I make this number smaller and smaller and smaller, the problem becomes more and more difficult. This is why this threshold is the level of difficulty that the problem has. Let us now look at the elements that this transaction contains, this function contains. Remember that I said something fundamental, which is in order to create this, to have a consistent ledger, we need a sense of time. And the sense of time is created in the mining process by the fact that in order, one of the parameters of the function that you have to solve is a hash. It's a number that represents the previous block. Each block has a signature, has a long hexadecimal number that represents it, that is unique for each block. You have to use this as an input for the function. Therefore, you must know which is the previous block, otherwise you are not able to start doing this thing. The second element that you need in order to solve this cryptographic problem is something that shows that you actually verify the transactions that you claim to have verified. Therefore, in something that is called the Merkle tree, which is the fact that you hash the transactions and you hash the hashes of the transactions and so on and so forth until you get a single hash that represents all the transactions that you have inside of your block. You get a single number that is this hash number that represents all the transactions that you have verified and that you have put inside of the block that you are creating. So this links to the previous block. This links to the previous block. This shows that you verified the transactions.
Are the transactions hashed in pairs only in the Merkle tree? Or is
In principle, I think that yes, you create all the hashes and then you do the hashes of all the pairs and so on and so forth until you have a single one. If I recall right, it's binary.
Pairs,
Yeah.
right?
Then, the third thing that you do, the third element that you put inside of your block is the one unknown, and this is exactly what you must find. You must find the number such that when you apply this number together with these two hashes to the function, the result that you obtain of this is smaller or equal than a threshold. Here, what you see is something particularly interesting. On the one hand is that we had this peer-to-peer network in this lower layer in the representation that I have shown before. All the miners are doing a similar task. All of them are brute forcing solutions for this function. However, it is not necessarily true that they have the same set of verified transactions in the block that they have created, because remember that the transactions are information that is only local. So you have to try many solutions possible solutions until you actually find one. And therefore, you see that the probability of a single node finding a solution to this problem is proportional in some way to the computational power that they have devoted to the process of solving this problem. So the more computational resources you put inside of the system to find this thing, the more likely is that you are going to find the solution with respect to everybody else. If I have a supercomputer and everybody else is mining with their mobile phones, most likely I am going to be able to try many more solutions, and then I am more likely to find it before everybody else. The value of difficulty, remember, I say that mining is created in order to arbitrarily limit the number of blocks that we create per unit of time. The level of difficulty is adjusted regularly, every 2 weeks in the case of Bitcoin, in such a way that given the total computational power that you have in the system, the probability, the rate at which new blocks appear and are appended to the blockchain is known. Which is the thing that someone would like to do inside of this? What is the first thing that someone would like to do while mining? Well, the best incentive that someone that has found a block was thought to be to broadcast the information about the new block to everybody else. Why? Because if I find the block and I distribute it to everybody, everybody gets to know the block, and this block has a transaction that goes to me. And I want to be sure that this transaction that goes to me is inside of the blockchain of everybody inside of the system, because this is, remember, what means that the transaction took place. For the, okay.
Sorry, Professor, what was the X there in the?
This is the problem. This is the unknown that you want to find.
Okay. If you could share the notation so you're using. So I mean, because you mentioned the symbol was the thresholds, and maybe we can get more information about it. You know.
Sorry, yes, but
Yeah.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because it will be difficult for us later to understand the function, you know, unless there's somewhere.
There is no. I can explain to you exactly which are the role of the different parameters.
Yes.
You're right, but remember, this is just a threshold. It's just an integer number. The only important thing about this threshold, it is just a number that says I want the result of this function to be smaller than this threshold. If you, for example, if this threshold is 100, the probability of finding, let us compare which is the probability of finding solutions for different values of threshold. If this threshold is 100, I may have some solutions. If these thresholds were 10, I would have 1/10 of the probability of finding the same thing, and this is what makes it more difficult. But remember that this variable, this was your question, remember that this variable x is simply a number that you do not know and you want to find. Therefore, your task as a miner is trying as many of these numbers as possible until you find one that satisfies this result. Okay? We said something. Remember, we say that what we want to do is to limit the rate of creation of new blocks. Remember that we say that this number is adjusted in some way such that the number of solutions that are found is basically equal to 1 every n minutes. And this is exactly what facilitates the process of predetermined supply growth inside of the cryptocurrencies. What I am plotting here is the total supply in the most well-known example, that is that of Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, originally, every time that a block was found, the reward was 50 Bitcoins, and there is a supply policy that says that every basically 4 years, the amount of Bitcoins that are rewarded for the creation of a new block is halved. But as I explained here, the reward that is given to a miner is completely arbitrary. There is nothing that says this is the reward that the miner should receive. There is no technological limitation on the way in which I can define this number. And this is why Bitcoin, in particular, has this predetermined, no, this is not why, but this is because of this, the amount of Bitcoins that are allocated in each block is an arbitrary decision, and the desire of halving the rate of Bitcoins is something that is artificial and is not related in any way to the underlying technology.
So the reward is per transaction?
No, it's per block. It's per block.
Is it per block?
As I said, remember, inside of each block, you verify a lot of transactions, and you are allowed to put inside of the block one additional transaction in which you get the reward. So there is one of such transactions per block. Okay? And here we see different levels, different kinds of monetary policy that have been present inside of these systems. Because what I said before, which is how do we create new assets, have multiple answers. The answer given by Bitcoin-like systems is you have a new amount of assets that are added to the system with the creation of each block. Bitcoin has a supply policy that follows this halving every specific period of time. Ethereum grows linearly in the number of tokens, of Ether tokens that are present inside of the system. There is another solution to solve the issue that I described before. When I described here, the problem that I was describing in this transaction was at the beginning of the public ledger, there has to be some process by which these tokens have been created. The simplest way of creating tokens is arbitrarily creating them at the very beginning of the launching of the platform. Okay? If you need some assets, just create everything at the beginning, and then you start making the transactions afterwards. You start redistributing this initial allocation by transactions later. This is what some of the blockchain-based technologies that exist implement, which destroys one of the initial reasons to create this kind of systems, that is, have a decentralized system. You are just creating a system in which a few actors, one or few actors, control all the supply and then they get exchanged afterwards. Yep, sorry.
Hi. We jumped out of session 2.1 into this. Do you intend to go back?
Absolutely.
Second question. At the start you said you discussed the implications of all of this, or sort of the big questions, the so what. I feel we're getting further away from that.
Sorry.
What are the implications of this? At the start you said you'd be discussing the high level implications.
Yes.
And are we to arrive at that, or is that coming?
What do you mean by the high level implications?
So you said that, so basically the so what of this. So you're taking us through the sort of the technical individual parts, but I'm personally struggling. What questions, as a decision maker, as a manager, as a business person, these things?
I'm going to go into this in a second.
Great.
Actually, it's the next thing that I wanted to discuss. So remember, now we have we have created now the system. Cryptocurrency has just created a scenario in which tokens are created, are supplied inside of the system. Why is it relevant, the monetary supply for this kind of systems? This is relevant because the incentive that this kind of supply is creating inside of the individuals that hold these assets is to, on the one hand, to participate of the mining process as soon as possible. Why? Because at any point in time, if I am here and I know that bitcoins are being created, I have the incentive to mine as soon as possible cryptocurrencies, because I know that the supply that is going to exist inside of the system at any future point in time is going to be lower. Okay? And this is why this kind of monetary policy of cryptocurrencies lead to a process in which hoarding is the best thing that can happen to the users. Users, the only role, remember, we have Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies were created to be a medium of exchange, a payment system. However, given the fact that the supply is only going to shrink in the future, there is no reason for anybody to spend the cryptocurrencies. So this artificial limitation in the supply and the shrinking of the supply that occurs over time only leads to divert the system functioning from the original design principle that it had. Different cryptocurrencies, which is particularly important, different cryptocurrencies have always similar paths of monetary creation. What you have is that the number of tokens that the systems are creating over time, in the best case, they grow linearly, which is something that is completely different from the usual monetary policies that large economies have, because in general, the total monetary mass that we have in normal economies grows together with the growth of the economy and the inflation. There is an additional point that this occurs, and this is what happens with this curve that I am showing below. Given the fact that you can trace, and this is why I was explaining the fact that you can trace transactions instead of the systems, one thing that you can do is analyze the total number of tokens that are actually in circulation inside of the system. And what you observe is that the total supply is 1 and the total circulating supply is sizably smaller in whatever cryptocurrency you are analyzing. This is Ethereum, this is Dogecoin, and this means that you have a very stringent monetary supply, and on top of this you have a even lower actual supply inside of the system. This is based on the fact that all cryptocurrencies are working on the assumption that, given the fact that they are scarce, they are valuable because of their scarcity. But exactly because of their scarcity and the ever-increasing scarcity that they have, nobody has the incentive to circulate them. When you look at the way in which these kind of assets have been implemented, what happens is that most of the cryptocurrencies are having, this is a study that we did on the family of cryptocurrencies that are present in the system, in real world implementations. What you see is that most of the cryptocurrencies that exist have either a limited deterministic monetary supply or they are premined, or they are in some way deterministic. So the level of exploration that has been experienced inside of the system, that has been deployed so far inside of these systems, is very little. This is also something that you can see by analyzing multiple cryptocurrencies from the point of view of which is the inflation at which the monetary, the rate at which the monetary mass grows over time. What we see is that basically all the cryptocurrencies that have been implemented so far basically follow exactly the same kind of trait with respect to how the new monetary mass or the new supply is created inside of the system. I go into details about how this process of mining impacts the way in which individuals have been behaving inside of the or joining these kind of systems. Here you have basically the level of difficulty and the total computational resources devoted to mining. And what you observe is that basically the total computational power devoted to this process has been growing exponentially, continuously, exactly of the economic mechanism that I explained before. Everybody has the incentive to mine as soon as possible inside of the system. This creates something that is fundamentally important in the way in which the process of mining gets concentrated, because of the following thing. This is remember, the probability of finding new blocks and therefore participating of the creation process of new tokens is proportional to the computational power that you devote to it. In the early days of Bitcoin, in 2010, in all this period, it was still possible to participate of the mining process with a single computer. Now you need 10 billion times the computational power to still participate of the mining process with the same probability, because this is the difference in computational resources allocated. So you need computers 10 billion times faster than the ones that you needed 8 years ago. This implies that in order to participate of mining, you need to devote outside of the cryptocurrency, you need to devote as an investment a very large amount of money. thousands of times what you needed to participate a few years ago. And the amount of investors that are able to participate of mining, exactly because of this, is much, much lower, and this is why the concentration in mining has only been increasing over time. Because there are fewer and fewer investors with the capacity of participating or investing the amount of money that is required. But this is a problem with respect to blockchain based cryptocurrencies. Because remember that mining is the process by which transactions are verified. And we need transactions to be verified in a fashion that is as distributed as possible. This is what we require inside of the system. However, as mining becomes more and more concentrated, the amount of users that are participating of the verification becomes more and more reduced. So all the verification is done by fewer. And therefore, the original question that is, why do, that is, in order for the system to be trustworthy, we need it to be distributed, we need the verification process to be distributed. This original assumption is being destroyed by the very same incentives that are created inside of the system. So we have created a system that requires decentralization, but because of the incentive schemes, and in particular because of the monetary policy that is implemented, this decentralization rapidly vanishes in the system, which weakens the trustworthiness of the system in the long run. So this is why the way in which the systems are conceived, all cryptocurrencies are conceived, is fundamentally important, and it is not necessarily the outcome of your original thoughts. Whenever a technical system, and in particular one as sophisticated as cryptocurrencies, is created, a policy for token creation, like the one that was implemented with some arguments that may have sounded reasonable 10 years ago, eventually leads to the own fate, the own weakening of the system as a whole as years pass.
But you're talking about proof of work now, right?
I am going to talk after the break about everything else, and I will see, and you will see.
What you're explaining, so basically.
So far I was only talking about proof of work. Okay. After the break I'm going to show that actually all the other verification processes that exist inside of cryptocurrencies suffer of the same limitation. Okay? And this is exactly where we stop now.